Welcome to our pod, and by that I mean on Wednesdays we read. I'm Hannah.
I'm Laura.
And we are two best friends who usually do a deep dive into a new book series, one book at a time, except when we are three
Three
friends.
best friends.
Because today we welcome to the podcast David Quantick, a screenwriter, novelist, and journalist. He has written for shows like Veep and his movie Book of Love, as well as stories like The Mule and Night Train and Ricky's Hand. Today we are having him on the podcast to discuss his new novella, Imagine a Friend, published by Stars and Sabers in March 2026. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you
Welcome.
so much for having me. Hi, Hannah. Hi, Laura. It's great to be here.
We are so excited to talk about this very cute novella. If you haven't read it yet,
Yes.
please read
Go
it.
get it. It's
Yeah,
so
it's so
sweet.
good. But I just listed off a litany of things you've been involved with, David, but you've done so many
Very
amazing
impressive.
things. Before we get into the book, can you kind of walk us through your career as a writer?
Blimey. Well, I started off writing for the music papers in the United Kingdom, and then I started writing comedy sketches for TV shows, and things like The Thick of It and Veep. That was a
Hmm.
big thing. I ended up working
I
on
love
Veep
Veep.
sometimes. It was a great
Huge
show. It was a
fans.
great, especially being an English writer, going to Baltimore and just working with these amazing. I used to say to people when I worked on British TV shows, I might see an actor I'd written for in a TV ad, but working on Veep was amazing because I'd see actors I'd worked with in movies. I'd be
Yeah.
going, "Oh my God, it's Tony Hale," and
Hmm.
it was an insane experience. And American comedy and British comedy are probably the best in the world. Don't fight me on that, but that's my opinion. Um, and but I also just I always wanted to be an author. And I've been trying since I was 17 to write novels, and I kept writing them, and they would just be, don't know, I wouldn't finish them or they wouldn't be right. And finally, about 10 years ago, I started writing novels that looked like novels and had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And yeah, now it's my favorite thing to do.
I love that. Well, in order to be a good writer, I feel like you have to be a good reader. So, can you tell us about you as a reader, like books that maybe you liked as a child and maybe books that kind of got you more interested in writing?
Oh God. I mean, yeah, when I was a kid, in Britain, we have these things called puffin books, which are part of the Penguin Empire. And what people in my generation would just call children's classics, Joan Aiken, C.S. Lewis, E. Nesbit back from the 19th century. Just this kind of tr classic British tradition of four children, possibly a dog, in an ordinary world, but something magical happens. And I love that form. It's the Scooby-Doo formula, basically. And I grew up reading those books, and I've never really stopped reading them. I remember them being read to me at primary school
Mhm.
when I was 6 years old, and I still have them, and my kids read them, and I read them. I read E. Nesbit, I read C.S. Lewis, I read Joan Aiken. If anyone's not read Wills of Willoughby Chase, Black Hearts in Battersea, the Dido Twite novels are some of the best novels in the English language. Um, so I grew up with that tradition. I was a little bit old for the more realistic, modern tradition and the later kind of Diary of a Wimpy Kid style novel. They're great. I've read them with my kids, but that's what I grew up with, and that's what I still read.
I love
That's
that. Hannah and I are also a little too old for the Diary of a Wimpy Kid, so we feel
No.
you on
my
that.
little nephew loves them. He's about to finish the
Yes.
complete collection, but
It's a
uh,
really interesting thing about them. It's one of those moments with kids when they're starting to get aware, you just say to them, "Is Greg a good guy?" Because when they're, "Oh yeah, Greg's great, he's really funny." Then after a while they go, "Dad, Greg's not nice, is he? He really treats Rolly badly." And it's kind of, "Oh, I get it."
That's it's very cute because like different kids have different styles. Because I remember I got my nephew something and he started reading it and he was, I don't like this character. I think he's mean. And he was so worried to tell me. And I was like, it's okay. You don't have to like
Oh,
every
that's really
character.
nice.
So, well, I feel like your inspiration, comes through of like your childhood favorites because Imagine a Friend does take place with child characters and they do have that fantastical nature about them. And it's such an amazing novella. Can you tell us a little bit how writing this, short novella of these wonderful children was a little bit different from any of the other scripts or novels you've written in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it really was. It's a different voice. Because when you write, because I come from comedy, when you write adults, they're often quite ironic. They're kind of like flip and hide their emotions and stuff like that. Don't wear their heart on their sleeve. Whereas with kids, generally, well, in this case, you don't really have that filter. So Louis, the main voice of the story, he's very upfront about his feelings.
Mhm.
And that was nice to write for a change. Instead of somebody going, "No, I don't love you. No, I don't care." So somebody going, "I'm really upset right now. I'm really angry. How has this happened? I must fix it." So that was a lot of fun. And yeah, no, the root of it, I didn't intend to write a book for people younger than me. I had this idea about an imaginary friend. And spoiler alert, what if the hero of the book is the imaginary friend, but doesn't know it? And that seemed to me a really interesting twist because the stories are always told from the point of view of the person left behind. They're like, "Oh, I forgot about you." And then quite often the imaginary friend turns up and they're really irritating. And it's like, "I've grown up and you haven't." But it's like, and then of course you write it, it just turns into a story about a broken friendship and, what it's like to lose a friend. And we've all had that, I'm sure. I hope not everybody, but what it's like to lose a friend. What is it like when somebody doesn't want to talk to you anymore? And it's horrendous. And then it was just the idea, well, this is Louis. He's quite determined. He's obviously going to try and reverse this. And it was like, "No, Louis, you can't do it." And somebody else, a grown up says, "You can't do this. Here's my story. It was a disaster." But he keeps going. And he finds Marcy. And Marcy, of course, is great. Well, hopefully she's great. And yeah, another spoiler, happy ending.
David, do you think it was difficult for you to write about this like fear of change and growth that the characters in Imagine a Friend face? Because I think that that's like a big thing for the characters is that they're really fearful of how their lives are changing and how their friendships are changing. Did you find it kind of difficult to write that?
I think it's very kind of you to say, but I think no, because one, I've experienced change in my life. There's that thing where, sometimes you have friend groups that last about 10 years. Not always, but you have friends. I've still got friends from childhood, which is amazing. And thanks to the internet, friends from really early. But it's the kind of thing you're at school, you have a bunch of friends, you move on in life. You have a job, you have a bunch of friends, you move on. Or you go to college, whatever. Quite often you have a friend group that you sort of shed. And maybe you grow,
Mhm.
and quite often when you're a little kid, you grow out of them. You're at school for small children. You go out, you meet new people, etc. So that wasn't, and also what was weird when I was writing it, it never says in the book how old anybody is, but they're kind of like at the end of childhood, so that everything's changing anyway.
Mhm.
I can't remember if they changed schools in the book, but that's about to happen. They're becoming teenagers, so everything's up for grabs. And it just kind of, I know it's a cliche when people say it wrote itself. It's like, no, it didn't. I wrote it, but it did write itself. It just said you have to go down this avenue.
I dig that.
That's yeah, that's amazing. Well, and you do have these characters who are on the brink of becoming teenagers, but I was so impressed because Louis is such a headstrong character. You mentioned it before, he wears his emotions on his sleeve, but I think you do such an amazing job of getting the tone of a kid who is at the point where they're about to become an adult and they just want their best friend back and they're still dealing with that childlike emotion. Can you walk us through how you were able to get the overall tone down for Louis and Marcy and all the different like children characters?
Um, I'm going to be really glib and say I think what I did was I watched the movie The Mitchells versus the Machines and imagined that
Interesting.
everybody in it was a character in that movie. Um, it's not quite true, but the real story about this is I wrote it as a film script. I first of all wrote it as a
Okay.
film script, and that's why it's in the first person because the first thing in the movie is Louis' voiceover. This is the part where I go every day, and this is where I met Mark, and it just became that voice. And once I got that voice, it was like there's a little bit of the young kid in the Mitchells and the Machines, who's this really enthusiastic kid who loves dinosaurs and maybe on the spectrum. And there's a little bit of Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes, only slightly nicer. And of course, Calvin and Hobbes is a key text in this because what is Hobbes? He's an imaginary friend.
Hmm.
Spoiler, but he is. And it's really kind of you to say all these things about it, but I really did just sit down and start writing. And as I'm sure you know, it's like sometimes you just get a voice in your head. And I can hear Louis' voice in my head. I don't even know if he's English or American, to be honest. I think the book is set in Britain from the way the language goes, but I have no idea.
Kind of transcends location, which is
That's
what you
very kind
want.
of you to say. I think I'll say that. Yeah, transcends location.
You have another character that like really stood out to me in this, which was, is it Ali? How you say it?
Yeah.
And Ali is interesting because Ali is an adult who is kind of portrayed as someone who is a little bit taboo and weird. And spoiler, he kind of tried to reconnect with his past and seems to hold on to his past more than the other adults in the novella do. And I was kind of wondering why you decided to give Ali a bigger focus in the novella and show this perspective.
I think it's because I needed I needed to show the consequences. And taboo, as you use that word, it's a really good word because it's a bit like again in the Philip Pullman novels when somebody loses their I've forgotten the name, their demon, and people
Hmm.
shun them. It's no one's sympathetic. They're like, "Oh, what's wrong with you, you freak?" And it's really nasty. And I kind of had this idea that Ali lost it, I think.
Hmm.
Didn't lose his mind, but he's unbalanced, like in his life. So he has to be on his own. People don't avoid him. Maybe they don't even know what happened. But he crossed a line. He did something and he suffered for it too. So he's really been through hell because he went through everything. He tried to make everything right and he was rejected a second time.
Hmm.
And also, Ali, the character, he's not based on a friend of mine, but I have a friend called Ali who's a big guy. He works security. He's a really big man. And I decided to name him after, and once I'd done that, I like this idea of this big guy being driving an ice cream van is kind of funny because it's a delicate thing putting little bits, scoops of
Hmm.
ice cream into cornets for kids, and so he's kind of a childlike person as well. The others are adults. They're like, we've accepted our fate. And Ali is like, no, I'm like Louis does. But yeah, he's damaged, and it was nice to give him, spoiler, a happy ending too.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah,
really
I think
nice.
it's a character that stood out to me because I know, like, and you can see just in the background here, I've got like a little toy just sitting on my bookshelf. Like, I'm somebody who I feel like kind of leans hard into nostalgia and like items from my past and like trying to honor my past and everything through my hobbies and interests. And especially more as I've gotten older, I've been trying to be like, oh, it's okay to like things that you liked as a kid. And I feel like you kind of see that in Ali and this wanting and desire to like keep things that you love alive in your life as you get older.
I think that's really important, and it's a mixed area because in Britain we're suffering in politics at the moment with what like the imaginary nostalgia, like always happens. The idea that once upon a time we lived in a golden country where all the problems, and it's like there was never such a time. But I think that said, it is important. Look, I'd like to reread the childhood. I have here an aeroplane, which is like a toy aeroplane, a model of replica of one that I had when I was a kid because it brings back happy memories. I
Mhm.
don't run around. Sometimes when people are out, I do run around the room making noises and doing that. But
As you should.
it's part of my life. I was a child. You
Hmm.
don't deny that. You don't have to be all Disney about it and talk about the inner child and all that kind of thing. But childhood is a massive part of your life, and you should
Hmm.
keep it with you, I think.
Well, and it's so interesting talking about like our inner childhood because I feel like you've built this very strong world of all of these people who were imaginary friends at one point, but then they have to live their life after they are forgotten. And that has so many deep themes and it's so
Hmm.
interesting, especially when you look at like Ali versus Louis' parents and how they kind of are like, this is just part of life. What was it like building this world of like imaginary friends who all have this tie based on deep-seated trauma that they all share?
I think it was just trying to keep the control of it because once you decide that I think everybody in the book has an imaginary friend. So, on
Mhm.
one side of the park is where all the imaginary friends live, and they all had, if you like, real friends. So, and it's just keeping a track on them. In the end, it's like trying to get everybody coupled up, paired up at the end. It's like, oh, that's my imaginary friend. Oh, that's him. He's her imaginary friend, and so on. So I got to be honest, I didn't go into the world too deeply. I just kind of put in what I needed to create that world. But yeah, I think it would be quite a deeply depressing book if you really went into all the case files of every single reject. There's probably an awful lot of mental health issues in the land of the imaginary friend. But
Well, on the other side too, because of they
Yeah.
had like that separation, a lot of people were suffering on the other side of the bridge. So,
I think you're right. I think just because you forget something doesn't mean it's not still in you.
Mhm.
Absolutely. There's another interesting thing that you've done too, which is So we do see Louis like really struggling to handle the loss of Marcy in the book, but he ends up actually making some new friends who are dealing with the grief of their own lost friendships in different ways than Louis is, and maybe even a little like more the opposite direction in the case of Ryan too.
Oh, I
Why
like
was it
Ryan.
why was it important for you to incorporate Ryan and Solange into this where they are sharing their own experience with being imaginary friends?
I think it was important to show that life goes on, it's just like relentless. And Louis is going to have new friends, and they're going to be from his culture, if you like.
Hmm.
They're going to be from the imaginary friend world. And I wanted to change a pace because the thing is, he can't be Marcy's friend anymore. So he's got to, life moves on whether you want to or not. So he has new
Hmm.
friends. He's a likable guy. And I wanted to just have some fun with friendship. Slightly less intense friendship with him. Louis and Marcy just sat in a room together, reading and hardly talking really. But with Ryan and Salah, I wanted a gang. I wanted to have a funny character. Ryan is a funny character, he's boisterous and annoying. And Solange is kind of more sensible. And I wanted this group dynamic. And also they're kind of his surrogate parents, because when he says, I'm going to find Marcy, they're like, no, 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 no. And they just do exactly what his real parents do. They just said, no, 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 but in a kind of more helpful manner, probably because they're younger and they haven't had the bitterness so badly.
Well, and it's nice because I like that it shows. I mean, Laura and I are best friends. We do a podcast together, and she's a deeply important relationship to me. And I have other friends outside of her, but I think it would still be deeply like hurtful if she and I ever didn't weren't friends. I do think it's interesting to have Ryan and Solange there to show like it's not that Louis doesn't have any friends, it's that he's missing his person, and I think that's very poetic.
I think, thinking about it now, if Louis had just moped for 10 chapters, it would have been quite a grim read. Chapter 20, still missing Marcy, can't think of what to do. It would have just been a bit relentless.
Well, I have noticed because I looked at some of your other works, you kind of like a little bit of like a surrealist tale where you have this interesting premise and then you dive deeper and deeper into it. And I think Imagine a Friend is very similar to that, where you have this premise of imaginary friends, but then you go deeper into what it's like to meet your imaginary friend in adulthood. What kind of draws you to these types of stories where characters are, struggling and going about this very weird premise?
I love surrealism. I grew up on a show called The Goon Show, which was a surrealist comedy in Britain, and Monty Python, obviously, a lot of surreal British comedy. And surrealism really affected me. Um, just the idea of the dream. Sometimes I think, the dream world is the real world, because when I see surrealist paintings, I'm like, oh, I know what this is about. I probably get it wrong, but I have an emotional connection to pictures of umbrellas talking to seagulls. And it's weird that you mentioned this because the next book I've got coming out is called The Hyena, and it's about a surrealist artist, a woman who's not famous. She never becomes a famous artist, but she probably because she's a woman. But it's set and starts in the 1930s, tells the story of her life, and the character has this revelation. She finds a book about surrealist art, and she's like, "Oh my God!" Suddenly a window opens, and I love surrealism. I mean, just I always, as a kid, liked books that were slightly odd. And it is that thing in a lot of classic kids' books, isn't it? The normal meets the weird. You go through a perfectly normal wardrobe and find yourself in Narnia. You are living in a grim house in the Old Kent Road with your family when you find a phoenix in a carpet. That sort of thing I absolutely love.
I think it's interesting too because I feel like I can see a lot of younger readers picking up this book, Imagine a Friend. And I do think that surrealism is a lot more palatable for a younger
Mhm.
audience. Not that adults won't read surrealism, but I do see this as being something that kids would get on board with, and the messages are being passed on easily through this medium. And I think that it's very apt that it was done in this way because I think that it's great for this audience and that they're going to be the type that will be like, oh yeah, well, this is what happens here and this is what happens here and this is what happens here. So I think you picked like the right way to work this into a meaningful story for kids. I also wanted to ask though, there are some things happening later on in the book, and you mentioned this because we have this theme of like addressing change and making amends and getting closure that happens. And we see several characters who are kind of frustrated earlier on and like experience this feeling that they can't go back and change their situations. They feel like they're stuck kind of. There's a lot of like, well, that's just how the cookie crumbles. And unfortunately, you can't go back and change it. But there is some resolution later on. I won't get too spoilery, but I was kind of wondering if you could tell us why you wanted to show the characters struggling with this inability to go back and then being able to tackle it later on.
I think because Louis is the catalyst, because it's like he starts a revolution, really. He changes everything. Like
Mm.
if I wrote a sequel to this book, I wouldn't know where to start because everything's, you'd have to go back and change everything back. Because everybody, it's that thing of like, everyone's like, well, nothing can change, you can't do anything. And then, and the lesson in the book is just hammered home. Everyone says to Louis, four characters say you can't do it. And then Ali turns up and he says, I will prove that you can't do it. And he does it. And then everyone is, and, is like,
Mhm.
okay, there is a door. It's like, can I go through that door? No, you can't. The door is locked. There's no way through. Then somebody opens it. It's like, let's all go through the door. And that, I think, is the answer to that question. I also
That's neat.
tried, it was kind of a low-key thing to make the real world nasty. So when Louis goes, spoilers, to the park for the first time, it's dark and it's cold and he doesn't know what these things are and he nearly gets
Mhm.
mugged. He does get mugged. And
Mm.
there are basically, there are homeless people that Marcy works with. And I just suggest the idea that there are none of these things in Louis's world
Mm.
because they're imaginary friends. So it's kind of an imaginary ideal world.
Mhm.
And it's that thing of bring the both together, the yin and the yang.
Well, it also brings up the theme of, a lot of this is the fear that you can't go back. And, when you're a child and you're going into this world with darkness, it's easy for the imaginary friend not to see it because they're just as childlike as the other person. But as they grow up, they're going to see the darker world. And so there is that
Mhm.
overall theme of, well, if you go over there as an adult, you can't go back. And that's an interesting
Can't
premise to,
unsee it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think putting a literal bridge in the story was kind of a bit on the nose, but
Yeah.
The cover is beautiful. Could you tell us a little
Yes.
bit about the
God,
cover design? Because I loved
I
the
love,
bridge. I
I
was, yeah.
absolutely love the cover.
Oh, it's so good.
He did such a great job. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very imaginary and, it has such a good image. So, and I actually, when I was reading this book, it felt more like I was reading a parable. Like I thought you did such an effective job of like a
Mhm.
parable of the imaginary friend.
Oh
So,
wow, that's amazing.
yeah,
Yeah, I wish I could pretend that that was the idea, but no, I just wrote an idea that I had.
it was a wonderful idea though.
I want to just
Well,
do a shout out just to Stars and Sabers, by the way, for printing it because I couldn't believe it. They've been absolutely brilliant, small indie, who just put out great stuff, and I like their stuff, and they seem to like mine, so that's good.
that actually was going to be my next question
Oh
because
wow.
I know you've had a lot of different experiences. You're a journalist, you've written other books. What was it like publishing with Stars and Sabers, as an indie publisher? What was the experience like for you?
It was great because I've done every kind of publishing. I think I've done self-published on Kindle, Amazon, I mean. I've had crowd-funded books out. I've been with larger publishers. I wrote some comedy books which did really well, ironically. What in Britain we call toilet books because that's where people keep them and that's where they read them. Um, but the amount of effort that Stars and Sabers have put in, it's like, they rang around, they did a lot of work to try and get press and stuff like that for me. They sent me book plates of this book
Mhm.
and bookmarks. I've got about 200 bookmarks, which I will be distributing to people when I do readings. Um, they're just really good they are really thorough. I had a really good editor. We went through the book, made sure it looked great. I was allowed to look at every change in the cover, just the things that really, and also they gave me some money. Not a vast amount of money, but they gave me some money. And that is the mark. There are so many people who write books now. They go, yeah, the publisher's really great. He says if I give him $10,000, he'll print my book. You're like, no, no, I cannot praise them highly enough. I
Good.
mean, I have to, but
You're being paid.
Yeah.
I'm being paid to. Yeah, that's what the money was for. It was a bribe.
Uh,
No, we've actually worked with Jendia before and had her on the podcast previously, and Jendia is great. We love Jendia. And so I'm sure that Stars and Saber is also awesome to work with. But I also wanted to ask, you mentioned in the acknowledgments, and I'm assuming these are your children's names, that they offered up some good ideas that you were able to incorporate into your book. Can you share like what some of their ideas were that they were bringing to you?
Yeah, one of my sons, he had the idea for the pictures on the bridge, which was really nice. That on the bridge, it's kind of like a wall of the missing that
Hmm.
people post. There's no explanation, there's no mention of it in the story, apart from the fact that on this bridge, there are all these pictures of people. And I like the idea that characters just come down and when no one's around, they just put a picture up. Like, if you go to Korea, there are all these beautiful check fences where people put padlocks,
Hmm.
couples put padlocks up, and it looks insane, just wall. And I like that idea. And my other son, I think he literally misheard me say imaginary friend. Or I think actually what happened was I said, look, I've got a problem. I can't call this book Imaginary Friend because there's a movie out called Imaginary Friend. There's a film called IF. Everybody, it just seemed like last year when I started writing, everybody had written something. And he said, Imagine a friend. And when you see it written down, it actually means something, which is nice.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's not just, a jumble of letters. It sounds like imaginary friend. Imagine a friend. It's really lovely.
Yeah.
Also, when you write a book for young people, as I'm sure you know, it really helps to have some young people around
Mm.
because you often see books, particularly by celebrities, and they clearly are people who don't even like children. So they just think like they just write and go like, Alan farted, ha ha. Then he picked his nose because that's what kids like, isn't it? Bodily functions. Then a bully came along and he died, but not before he farted. And kids do like that, but yeah.
Well, it was
I feel
nice
like we
because
often don't give kids enough credit for being able to handle deeper themes. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, that there's a little too much focus on the farting of it all and not enough focus on kids are actually dealing with a lot in their lives and changes like friendships changing, them growing, going to new schools, dealing with difficulties at home, all of these like and in the world we're living in, like all sorts of different things happening, poverty, inequality, chronic illness, all these things that affect children too. And we don't give kids enough credit in their ability to be able to be resilient and handle these things. And we should be portraying these things in books too. And I appreciate that you did that in this book.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's just always been an aspect of children's literature, as far as I know. It may not be the obvious theme of the book, but so many kids' books. There's loss, there's divorce, there's a dead parent, there's being uprooted. I think, in The Railway Children, which is one of the sweetest Edwardian children's books, the dad's in jail. He's a political prisoner. They don't shy away from stuff. You don't have to make a big deal of it and make it a gothic
Mhm.
novel, but a bit of reality really helps.
Yeah.
well, I think you do that, especially in the opening chapters where we find out a little bit about Marcy's home life, but not too much. And that's kind of a very, it's the catalyst of the book where we start hearing about imagining a friend and doing things like that. So it's really
Mhm.
effectively done.
Oh, thank you. It is just right. I don't know. Sometimes things appear. Feel like I'm in a video game and it's like, oh, I need a sword. Oh, there's a sword. Oh, I need an axe. Oh, I haven't got an axe. I've got a carrot. But actually, that turns out to be more useful later on.
Beautiful. Well, listeners, if you haven't read this book yet, what are you doing?
Please
Because
go
we
get
just discussed so
Imagine a
many
Friend.
things. It's
Such a good novella.
so good. The cover is beautiful. And as you
Mhm.
can tell, Laura and I adored reading it. So thank you so much, David, for writing it.
Yes.
Thank you for having me on. It's been brilliant.
Of course. And could you tell our listeners something you're reading, watching, and or enjoying right now?
Okay, I'm enjoying walking the dog because in Britain it's finally spring
Oh,
and
beautiful.
everyone's just remembered what life is like with blue skies. I am watching on TV For All Mankind on Apple TV, which is a fantastic science fiction show. And they had episode 3 of this season, no spoilers, but there's a major development. And like many men of my age, I spent the day crying abominably, massive tears of emotion
Oh,
because of what happened in the episode. And I am reading a book, I think it's called The Cinderella Story by Neil Phillip. And it's basically all the Cinderella stories from all around the world in all their not all of them, that would be mad, but all the main Cinderella stories around the world from France and Germany and China, where I think it started. And it's just fascinating the way stories evolve and change and characters disappear. And they've only been like a fairy, there's only been a fairy godmother and a carriage with a rat driving it for about 200 years.
Those all sound
Amazing.
so
Well, you've
amazing.
sold me
Yeah.
on that show for sure. Because
Right?
anything where people don't give a ton of info but say that they spent a lot of time crying, I'm like, what? I need to cry.
You have to watch all 5 seasons though, otherwise it doesn't
Oh
work.
You know
man.
what? I am known to binge something. So,
Giving her a new homework assignment, so it's perfect.
yes.
Excellent.
So,
David, where can people find you online and find your works?
I have a website, davidquantick.com. Starsandsabers.com does this book. Amazon and Waterstar, other shops do that. I got a Substack, which I just wrote a whole thing about writing today. Just if people are genuinely interested, just Google. Fortunately, my name is obscure and very easily Googleable. It's a range of hills in Somerset with a different letter, in case you're interested. So yeah, I'm all over the place, literally.
well,
And I
we'll
will include a link to where to find David in the show notes.
yeah,
Thank you
so
very
check
much.
him out there. And we enjoyed this book so much. I can't wait to
Yes.
read The Hyena too. That sounds amazing
Hmm.
as well. So everyone go check out David's works. And as you know, you can find us on OWWR Pod on Bluesky, Instagram, and TikTok sometimes, as well as OWWRpod.com. Make sure everyone's going to check out David. And David, again, thank you so much
Thanks
for
so
coming
much for being
on.
here.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing this and publicizing it.
Oh, perfect. Well,
Awesome.
thanks, listeners. Bye.
Bye.